Chris.
All right.
And then we tie back in together.
Now for part two before we weave it all together. So thank you. I won't need this because I knew it would be hard to write and talk.
Yeah, I was going to say, you can't really read what I'm writing
Mine
there.
are pre-done. I'm going to leave Jake's comments up there, though, for a while because they tie in with what I'm going to talk about. So, it's interesting that we've been having so many conversations around imposter syndrome at this event so far, because last night when the question was asked around the table, hey, who suffers from imposter syndrome, right? In a moment of hubris, I decided not to raise my hand because, which was stupid on my part, because of course I suffer from imposter syndrome. I don't suffer from it from being on stage, being on camera, being on a microphone. I'm like, I am good at this. I know this is one of my unique skills. That's not an area where I suffer from it. But my story around where I suffer from imposter syndrome, I've got a very good example, because when Jake and I are on calls talking to our prospects and potential clients, you heard it last night. Jake was talking about one of his posts where it's like, oh, it only got 15,000 views, right? It's nothing. And I'm like, I feel pretty good when I get a 15,000 view post, right? So when we're sharing our metrics on, how our content is performing, what's there, Jake has, let's say, one of the best followings you can have on LinkedIn, right? Big numbers, big niche, right? So in those moments, right, I have that instant of, it's like, what am I doing here, right? I've got 20%, 25% of the following Jake has. But then I think about what my unique influence is as a podcaster. So I'm going to share some stats and stories here in the coming slides. But the first of three things I'm going to talk about is knowing your value, right? Jake has talked about this in his portion of the discussion. But I'm going to share what it's like knowing your value from a personal standpoint. So as a podcaster, what I bring to the table is a little different than, let's say, an Instagram influencer, right? A couple stats that have rung out for me from Edison Research. These might be a couple years dated. But, people are 45%, or I should say 45% of listeners are likely to visit someone's website when they hear about them on a podcast, right? And on top of that, 42% of people are likely to consider a new solution when they hear about it on a podcast, right? So in my case as a podcaster, hey, it's hard to get downloads in a niche podcast that are in the tens of thousands, right? But the fact that I have over 1,000 people listening to the show every week, and those type of percentages are considering new solutions, making decisions around what they hear on the show. I didn't mean to glare at you, Emily. That was my fault. It's an impressive. It's something where it comes down to, hey, as a podcaster, sure, this looks different from what, let's say, a LinkedIn influencer, an Instagram influencer might come across as. But for me, it's knowing that this is my value, right? High fidelity audience, really dialed in a niche of manufacturing leaders that are making decisions at the companies that they serve. So point number one, know your value. Second thing I'm going to say in this part of the discussion is listen to your audience. So what I was just sharing, I was sharing a bunch of nebulous stats around how powerful podcasts can be, right? If we remember anything from the last session, stories resonate a lot more than stats. So I'm going to share a quick story. So I always knew that as a podcaster, a lot of the value comes from the fact that you have a high fidelity niche audience. What I didn't know is all the value that would bring to the guests that appear on my show. So I think when we think of value in the terms of the things we do, we often default to leads and impressions and the things that companies get. But as I started listening to my audience and the guests that had been on my show in the past, they started opening me up to new areas of value that I didn't even realize I was bringing to begin with. Very specifically, I was talking to one of the people that had appeared on the show, and they said, hey, we've been using your podcast as a recruiting tool. We showed it to a set of people we were interviewing for our company, and the fact that some of the people listened to this episode and didn't really get what our company was about and didn't get what our mission was, we were able to weed out 3 people that we otherwise would have extended an offer to that we just realized weren't going to be a fit, right? And don't get me wrong, there are other things they do to vet people in that process, right? The podcast isn't the end all be all. But if you think about it, and you can probably correct me on this, I think it's something like a bad hire costs roughly 30% of their first year income. It's around there. So if that person's $50,000, that's $15,000 down the drain. Or if that's a $100,000 person, that's $30,000 down the drain. And I can tell you, when I do my type of sponsorships, that ROI is there. If you can weed out just even one mediocre hire or get one great hire on the flip side of that. So that's what it comes down to, like listening to your audience, right? I think one of the things of getting out there and doing something consistently is you have an inkling of what your value is going to be when you start. Jake brought up a great point, right? Talk to the people you're partnering with, figuring out, hey, what do they want to get out of this, right? But you're going to learn new things that you bring to the table as you go through this journey of creating content, creating your business, and working with the audience and the people that you serve. Final thing I'm going to say is set the bar high, right? I feel like it's very cliche to say like raise the bar, but I think people should just like set the bar high to begin with, right? Establish that as the initial baseline. And as a podcaster, I try to do this in a few different ways, right? Like what my main message around this point is that there are a lot of people out there that can probably be doing something very similar to what you do. I often think about, hey, are influencers getting commoditized, right? Well, I can't tell you how many conversations I have where people are just looking for impressions for a trade show that's coming up that's going to come and go. There's value there, don't get me wrong, right? But if more and more people are the individual that's out there sharing something on social media to get those impressions, what are the things that's going to set you apart? And I get worried that, you know, as spaces get bigger and bigger, people are going to kind of self-devalue that space as well, right? They're going to be lazy. They're not going to follow up. They're going to give influencers a bad name. So, you know, what are the things that you can do to go beyond being an influencer and being the only person that does what you do? Gary Miller Resource Group, we talk frequently. I think some of you are familiar with that company, but he's a big fan of the Grateful Dead, and I'm a big fan of music, and through osmosis have gotten more into the Grateful Dead. I lived off of Haight-Ashbury for like 5 years of my life, right? So it was always in my backyard. But I think the most important lesson to pull from the Grateful Dead is that they weren't the best at what they did. They were simply the only ones that did what they did. So how can you be the only one that does what you do? You know, I'll share what I try to do with my show at the, Manufacturing Happy Hour. One, I want to be the best interviewer I can be. Every time I'm interviewing someone, my goal is to, pull the stories out of them. Again, storytelling, but also ask the questions that you're not going to find answers to on the internet. We live in an industry where it's like, tell me about your company. What differentiates you, right? It's like, I can probably look that up on the website. Just because it's on a podcast doesn't mean I'm going to be any more interested in it. But if you can find the things, really dig into people's why. Why do they do what you do? Why are you passionate about this space? Those are the things that you're not going to find on someone's webpage. The other thing is being consistent, right? I know this is a challenge that we all work with on a regular basis. I should work with, struggle with, perfect on a regular basis to try to get that right. Being consistent is hard, but in the case of my show, I heard from one of my peers recently in the podcasting space, Travis Chappell, ran a great show called Build Your Network for a long time, recently rebranded. But he was talking to one of his guests that's also a podcaster. He says, hey, if you're going to run a show, you got to run this like ESPN, right? Like it comes out same time every week, professional quality. Do not slack and let it come out a day late, an hour late, whatever it is. You got to get it at the right time. And the other thing on top of it is, hey, create a premium offering, right? I decided early on, it's like, hey, anyone can do a podcast, right? And they're like, people subscribe and listen to it on iTunes and Spotify. But what can I do to take that to the next level by creating micro content, quotes, images, videos, all those little pieces of content that come out of those things that create an offering that at the end of the day, no one else in the industry can do. So that's what I'm doing today. I think one of the important things is that this is just what I'm doing presently. I always need to be thinking ahead. It's like, what can people do to continue to replicate what I'm doing? And what can I do to continue to stay ahead of that to differentiate, right? That's why coming to an event like this, throwing an event like this, I think is so important, because not only are we sharing what we're doing today, but I'm hoping that through these conversations, we start thinking about, hey, what are the things I can do to prepare to be relevant 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now? Because I think that's something we're all, we all have long careers ahead of us, right? We're in, as far as I'm concerned, we're all still in the early innings of what we're doing for work. So thinking about what differentiates us, how we can keep going, that's where I want you to be thinking about, hey, knowing your value, listening to your audience, and setting the bar high so you continue to stay ahead of the pack in our space and continue to give influencers a great name. So, Jake, let's take questions from the field.
Hey, you said something, Chris, when it comes to knowing your value, that you provide high fidelity. So if someone just hearing that for the first time, can you break that down to very simple terms?
Yeah. So what is a high fidelity niche audience, right? It's a very targeted group that, while it's not going to be Joe Rogan podcast numbers, you're talking to the right group of 100, 500, 1,000 people every week, right? Because let's think of it this way. There are 12 of us in this room right now. This feels like a lot, but the reality is, hey, if you think of 100, a room of 500 people, a room of 1,000 people, that's a ton of people as well, right? So there's a lot that goes on top of that. So you're really focused on dialing into an audience that's the exact type of group that, let's say, a manufacturing solutions company would want to speak to, right? So you've got that very dialed in audience. The other thing I'll say about that is you get to know that audience as well. So I can articulate to the people I talk to, it's like, everyone that listens to my show, every single person with the exception of my parents, are manufacturing leaders, right? And what I mean by manufacturing leaders is, yes, 25% of my demographic is executives, 25% is early career talent, right? So obviously not everyone is the person behind the main purse strings at the company. But what I can say confidently is the person that takes 40 minutes out of their week on a regular basis to listen to a manufacturing podcast cares about their career, cares about their business, cares about the industry, and whether they're the person that calls the shots or whether they're the person that's sitting in a meeting that says, hey, I heard this good idea recently. I think we should try something new, right? Those are the movers and shakers, the doers, the thinkers that are making change within their companies. So hopefully that answers your question, what that high fidelity audience is. It's a very specific group that you can pretty much describe almost to a personal level, that while the numbers might appear small from impressions on social media or downloads for a podcast, right? Those are numbers that are still really impactful when you think about it in the context of a concert hall or an auditorium.
When you were talking, Jake, about defining your value when it comes to monetization, when you're finding that value, are you finding that value derived from your followers and impressions, or are you supposed to derive that value from your price, from the value you're adding to whoever?
Yeah. No, great question. I think a lot of it has to do with going off of kind of like what Fidelity said with Chris. When it comes to our audiences and being an influencer and a content creator, the value is driven by we are people that are in that market. We're a lot of times when you have influencers out there in the industry, they're just a person who has a high amount of followers that can just reach a lot of people. But the manufacturing industry is unique in a way because we're such a niche market. Our followers are also the people who are in our exact industry. So like when I talk about describing a value, I think it's two things. One is your voice and your authenticity that you share is your own and it's relatable that way. And at the end of the day, when I always like to say people relate to people a lot better than they relate to a company. So the value that you bring to them is an independent voice rather than a manufactured one that comes from a company. And that's why I think every company should be leveraging personal brands at a much higher level than that. I mean, I would use Tim as an example. TW Control is successful, not because Tim has an amazing program. It's just because he has an amazing personal brand that has 60,000 followers on YouTube that is a lead-in tool to your classes.
Well, to speak to that a little bit, originally my YouTube channel was TW Controls.
Yeah.
And I realized, hey, I gotta do something.
And now it's...
I can't compete with these big guys. I gotta do something to stand out.
And now it's Tim Wilborn.
That's why we went to Tim Wilborn. It's like, no, I'm a person that is here to help.
Yeah. And I think, so that's the value, is you're an individual voice rather than in the corporate. And I think that's like why a lot of things as well is more and more companies are working with individuals rather than large publishing companies, you know, as well, because there's that value from authenticity from an individual rather than a magazine, you know.
No one is doing what we're doing here. We are the only 12 doing this right now for our industry. There are a lot of great ideas we can just borrow from everywhere else. Any other questions? Or maybe my favorite question. Is there anything you wish we would have talked about that we haven't yet, for those that know manufacturing happy hour?
How do you approach potential partners, especially like early on? Like obviously now people come to you guys.
Okay.
Like,
So,
early on,
yeah, like I'll share my story. Like for me, I always believed in, I mean, I believed in the long con of like when I was first getting going and I saw potential for partnerships, I went on LinkedIn and I searched manufacturing and marketing keywords in titles for LinkedIn, and I connected with everyone. I never gave them a sales pitch. I never said, thanks for connecting. I just connected with them and I let my content create it. And at the end of the day, I let the FOMO make them come to me. Because as soon as I brought in one robot company, I brought in UR, then we had KUKA, and then we had Kawasaki, and then we had Abu, and then we had Fanuc, you know, so like, I think a lot of the times is reach out to the companies that you want to work with and then show them what they're missing without even engaging with them. And like, I think that, at least for me personally, that was one of my biggest driving successes, is make sure the people you want to work with are actually seeing your content, but do it in a way that makes it feel like they need you. You don't need them.
I think that's the leverage you have, like a leverage. Like I think photos would be number 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for Chris, like you on yours, you know, I think you said about 5, but I think you said like differentiate.
Yeah.
I think that's a really key thing too. So
Yeah.
I'm taking some stuff.
Yeah.
My story.
I see the people comments on LinkedIn.
Nice.
Yeah. And that's what literally this event's for, is like, we created it in a way where it's FOMO. So when people want to do it, we can create something, you know.
I have a slightly different answer to how I figured out what to charge and how to partner and how to approach partners, right? I mean, I think this one thing that's very similar between our stories is we were just kind of doing our thing, and then someone else is like, can we pay you to do it, right? And I'm like, oh, well, that's an idea. But in my case, I remember when I put together my first like podcast sponsorship, it was with one of my buddies in the industry. He's like, hey, we'd love to get our company on there. And, you know, I put together the proposal and I showed it to him. He's like, yeah, sounds great. I love everything you're describing. By the way, you could probably charge us a whole lot more for that. So just like, I think back to my earlier point, listen to your audience, listen to your clients, right? Like, I feel a lot of us have a tendency where it's like we need to think we've got all the answers like the first time around. I mean, set a baseline that covers your cost, covers what you feel you're worth. Then you'll start feeling out, hey, is this the main offering I want to have? Are there other offerings I can have? So I think it's just, I use this as a cop-out answer a little bit, but it's about getting in the momentum of doing the first thing, and then it becomes easier to, you know, adjust for the next one when you do it again, or, you know, adjust course when you do something, you know, related, but a little, you know, maybe a different offering at that point.
With you brought that up, the one other thing that I would add to this is have your authenticity, but show your professionalism. If you're out there and you're working with corporate companies, you need to show them that you are not just this isn't a side hustle. You can have that authentic front, but like when I'm bringing clients on board, I have a full market segment campaign. Like we walk through like 9 different documents, from everything from understanding what their business overview is, to what their marketing campaign is for the entire year, to what each segment looks like, to what shows they're going to, what they're putting at their shows, what partners are pushing at the shows. And for you, I think before you even then talk about the money, they just all of a sudden say, oh, this person gets us. And that's also pushing going to the discovery phase, but you need to show them, hey, I have a marketing sheet. I have a database on how we track what we're looking for. I think that's the big thing is that makes companies step into that comfort zone, because a lot of times, most of these companies have never worked with an influencer before. So for a lot of them, you need to show them that it's safe because they're taking a risk on you. In a lot of cases, they're taking a risk on like doing a podcast for the first time and spending a lot of money doing that, or like paying a guy to share a video. You know, there's a lot of stuff with that. So I think whatever you can do to alleviate the risk of when they're trying something new it can definitely turn and make the income possible. And it takes time to do that, but like build out your portfolio of your success stories and your offerings and stuff like that.
You guys think of yourself as an independent channel?
Definitely.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah,
That's where I don't have imposter syndrome.
yeah,
It's a mindset.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Am I a industry influencer, content creator? Absolutely. You know, yeah, I have that authenticity, but you step behind what I would call the paywall. There's a full business plan running like on everything. That there's dates, there's guidelines, there's checks, there's all that stuff. And I think that's just the thing where you can really turn this into a full-time income when you have that mindset of organization.
Manufacturing Happy Hour is one of the top-rated independent media companies in the manufacturing industry. I just made that up right now, but I think part of it is like, you know,
but it's the mindset that you're
approaching
creating
your
with that, though.
conversations
Yeah.
with that like matter-of-fact mentality. Like, and that's not a lie. You could go look at iTunes and the reviews and comments are there. So it's like it takes a while to get into that groove where you're like, yeah, this is what I do and this is the thing that I do the best. But it's, you know, kind of to the statements we were talking about earlier, like making I am statements. Like I'm gonna, you know, whether it's just about your day or whether it's about your business.
Yeah.
It's getting into like those affirmations for yourself, right? Getting that confidence.
And I think it's one of those things is it's not bragging. It's you showing the value that create. Like one of the things that I say is every week I reach more people than every single manufacturing automation trade show and conference that happens in North America every single year. I reach that audience in 1 week, you know, because I'll reach 1.5 million people each week on social media. Like you could take every single trade show and conference that happens every year, combine them all together, and I'll get that view in a week, you know, or one day, like I'll make a post and I'll have more views than the entire attendance of an IMTS trade show.
I think it's about knowing your value relative to the other options that are out there.
Yeah.
We haven't necessarily said that specifically, but knowing, hey, how can you reach that auditorium of 500 people, right? Well, the podcast is the way to do it.
And with that said, though, you need to clearly define that it's not one or the other, it's both.
Yes.
And like that's the biggest thing. Like when I was on, and no one from IML was able to make it out this week. Joe from Gorilla 76 wasn't able to make it out, but like I was on their podcast last week, and we had Mary and I go head to head when it comes to trade shows on stuff like that, where she's very, and I want to say anti-trade show. She's just very against with how trade shows have done. Where I'm very on the other aisle. I'm very pro trade show, and I think it's one of those things where you need both, but you need to do it right. And here is a niche market that I think you're missing where, a trades publication magazine is really cool because you have the engineers who get their information that way to do that. However, younger generations, you need to reach in a different way because younger generations aren't subscribing to Controls Engineering magazine. They're looking on YouTube. They're looking on social media. They're finding information on TikTok. There's control panel pages on TikTok right now that have over 100,000 followers. Or welders on TikTok that have over 100,000 followers. It's just like, that's just the way things are doing. Is one better than the other? No, but each one presents in a unique market, and that's why you leverage it that way. So here would be my number one recommendation. This is what I found. Go back to whatever content you produce. If you're producing podcasts, if you're producing videos, if you're doing in-booth trade shows, if you're doing YouTube reviews or whatever, or you're building out marketing campaigns, go back and define what would I view as the most 5 successful pieces of content that I created. Go back and look at those and say, what company am I not working with now or that I know of that post would be a direct value stream representation of what they're doing. And like, then I would say, this post performed X amount, that got a really good engagement. Now, can I take that exact same thing and saying, hey, I want to work with you. Here's a previous post that I made where I'm highlighting a trade show manufacturing process or a booth demo or a product review or interviewing an executive at a company that's pushing DEI as one of their initiatives. I have this successful story. You should do this too. How do we get you? How do I share your story with my audience and my content? And so like, if you don't know what that is, that's where I would say, go out and do that. And I have everything. Maybe we get today, I'll share with you my massive CRM Excel sheet that I have. But like, if that doesn't exist, go online and download shield.ai, which is a LinkedIn plugin that gives you trending data on every single post that you've ever made, including its audience, its likes, its followers. There's a personal version and there's a business version. Do it for 1 month, because I'm actually talking with another company that has something very similar that they're rolling out, and we're trying to get free memberships to all that. So
nice.
like, do it for like 1 month, but you can go in there, generate the whole entire thing, download it as an Excel sheet, and then look at what was your most trending content, and then pick that out, and then go in there and saying, how is this content relatable to a manufacturer? And like, that's where I would start with that. So like, that's spot number one. Step number two is create a marketing portfolio. What am I looking at here? A media
kit.
A media push. It could be anything from like literally 1 page to 11, 15 pages now, and just push out there. This is who I am. This is my audience. This is my market segment. This is who I reach. This is the value that I'm driving, and this is why you should work with me.
And don't feel overwhelmed by any of this, right? I still use a pretty general email for a lot of my media kit stuff.
Yeah.
Like, you can just say, hey, these are the 1, 2, 3 bullets that people have derived value from on the show before, right? And if someone's actually really interested and you're putting out content that reflects who you are and what your business is on a regular basis, the hope is that you don't have to do a lot of selling once you start the conversation with them, right? They're pretty much in or out. Like, whatever I have for my media kit or my email is just kind of icing on the cake. That I don't think it probably hasn't really skewed a deal one way or another. It's probably informed some people that aren't familiar with what I'm doing, what it's all about. I think that's the most important thing. But with anything, right? It's not what's closing the deal.
Mm-hmm.